I would rather marry my horse." The words rang through the glass-walled conservatory like a gunshot. Laughter and music from the ballroom beyond could not soften them. They were sharp, cruel, and meant to wound, and they did. Isabella Everly stood frozen, her gloved hands trembling at her sides. For a moment she could not breathe. 12 seconds earlier, she had been brave. Foolish perhaps, but hopeful. Now, she felt as though the ground beneath her feet had vanished. Edward Hawthorne, Earl of Thornfield, stood before her with a glass of brandy in his hand. His face was calm, almost bored, as though he had not just shattered a young woman's life with a single sentence. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that missed nothing, he looked every inch the powerful man society admired, and in that moment, he was her executioner. Isabella swallowed hard. The warm air of the conservatory, heavy with roses and damp earth, pressed against her chest. This had not been how it was meant to go. Only minutes before, she had stood outside these glass doors gathering courage. At 25, she was already whispered about. Too old, too poor, too unfortunate. Her father's financial ruin had stripped their family of everything that once protected her. Invitations had slowed. Smiles had cooled. Friends had quietly disappeared. Tonight was supposed to change that. The Earl of Thornfield's Spring Ball was the most important event of the season in Derbyshire. To be invited was an honor. To be noticed was everything. Isabella had borrowed her gown from her last loyal friend, Catherine Pembroke. It was ivory silk, mended twice at the sleeves, but in candlelight it looked respectable. Enough, she had hoped. She had seen Edward across crowded rooms before. Their eyes had met. He had spoken to her kindly at a garden party, discussing horses and books. He had listened, truly listened. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that he saw her as more than a ruined name, so she had come to him tonight to speak plainly, to offer honesty in a world built on pretense, and he had crushed her for it. "I would rather marry my horse," he repeated lightly, as if amused by his own wit. "At least the animal has good breeding and requires less conversation." The words struck her like blows. Isabella's knees weakened, and she reached for the stone fountain beside her to steady herself. Shame burned her cheeks. Her heart felt torn open, exposed to the cold. Before she could speak, a sharp gasp echoed behind her. Isabella turned. The conservatory doors stood open. Lady Peyton stood in the doorway, her eyes glittering with delight. Behind her were others, too many others. Ladies and gentlemen who had been enjoying champagne moments before now stared openly, hunger for scandal written on their faces. Lady Peyton pressed a hand to her chest. "Oh my," she said loudly. We heard voices and feared someone might be unwell. The lie was obvious. The damage was done. Isabella looked at Edward. Surely now he would soften his words. Surely he would see the audience and realize what he had done. He said nothing. That silence was worse than his cruelty. Isabella straightened her spine. Every lesson her mother had ever taught her rose to the surface. Dignity, even in ruin. "Forgive the intrusion, my lord," she said quietly. "I see I misunderstood the nature of our acquaintance." She dipped into a shallow curtsy, barely polite, then turned and walked past Lady Peyton and the others. She did not run. She would not give them that satisfaction. The ballroom seemed endless. Music played on, but conversations fell silent as she passed. Faces turned. Whispers followed her like a rising tide. "Did you hear what he said?" Compared her to his horse. Well, after her father's scandal, she must have been desperate. Isabella's vision narrowed. She focused only on the door. Step by step she crossed the room, her borrowed gown brushing against polished floors that no longer welcomed her. At the entrance hall, cool air met her flushed skin. A footman summoned her carriage without comment. When it arrived, she climbed inside with mechanical grace. Only when the door closed did her body begin to shake. The carriage rolled away from Thornfield Manor, its glowing windows fading into the darkness. Isabella pressed her hands together in her lap, breathing shallowly. "I would rather marry my horse." The words echoed again and again in her mind. By morning, all of Derbyshire would know. By the end of the week, London would whisper. Miss Isabella Everly, the impoverished gentleman's daughter who dared to offer herself to an earl and was publicly humiliated for it. She closed her eyes. She had survived her father's ruin. She had survived her mother's death. She would survive this, too. She had no choice. The next morning dawned too quietly. Isabella lay awake in her narrow bed at Mrs. Hartley's boarding house, staring at the stained ceiling. The silence felt heavy, waiting. Outside, London stirred as usual. Carts rattled. Vendors called. Life moved on. A knock came at her door. Miss Everly, the maid said carefully, your breakfast. The tray held tea, toast, and a folded newspaper. Isabella's hands trembled as she opened it. The society column did not name her. It did not need to. A certain impoverished young lady, it read, created quite the spectacle at a recent ball by declaring her affections to a distinguished earl. His response, comparing matrimony unfavorably to equine companionship, has set tongues wagging. Isabella folded the paper with care. By noon, she dressed in her plain brown day gown and set out to make calls. Routine, she told herself. Routine would save her. One by one, doors closed to her. Lady Pembroke was not receiving. Mrs. Ashworth was unwell. At one house, she saw a curtain move, then fall back into place. By afternoon, the truth was clear. She was finished. The letter from her employer arrived that evening. Her position was no longer tenable. Her services were no longer required. When she visited her father, he begged her to write to the Earl, to apologize, to explain. No, Isabella said, her voice cold and steady. I would rather starve. That night, another letter arrived from a distant cousin in a small northern village called Wickham. A boarding house, a school in need of a teacher, no salary, only room and board. It was honest work, respectful. Isabella packed her belongings into 2 small trunks. Before leaving, she found a book she had once planned to give Edward, poetry he admired. She dropped it into the fire and watched it burn. At dawn, she boarded a coach and left London behind. She did not look back. And far away, in a grand house that would one day fall silent, Edward Hawthorne went on living, never imagining that the woman he had destroyed would become the only one he would ask for when death finally came knocking. 12 years passed. Time moved forward, whether wounds healed or not. Seasons changed. Faces aged. Memories dulled at the edges but never fully disappeared. Isabella Everly became Miss Everly. In Wickham, no one cared about ruined names or past scandals. The village sat in a shallow valley, quiet and modest, surrounded by fields and stone cottages. When Isabella arrived with her 2 trunks and tired eyes, no one asked why she had come. They only asked what she could do. So she taught. The schoolhouse had been little more than a storage shed when she first stepped inside. The roof leaked. The benches were broken. There were no proper books. Isabella rolled up her sleeves and began anyway. She taught letters and numbers to daughters of farmers and shopkeepers. She taught them how to read contracts, how to count wages, how to speak clearly and stand straight. She taught them that their minds mattered, even if the world told them otherwise. At night, she wrote by candlelight, essays, thoughts about education, pieces signed with a false name. Slowly, quietly, her words found readers. Life in Wickham was not grand, but it was real. Mrs. Winters, who ran the boarding house, became family. The baker left extra bread at Isabella's door. The butcher refused full payment. Kindness replaced charity. Respect replaced pity. And love took a different shape. Not the dangerous, hopeful love of her youth. Not the kind that knelt in conservatories and offered hearts to men who could crush them. This love was steady, earned, safe. She told herself she did not miss Edward Hawthorne. Big Bear, that was mostly true. Then one evening, as spring softened the air and her students' laughter drifted through open windows, a black-bordered letter arrived. Thornfield Manor. Her hands stilled. Mrs. Winters watched her carefully as Isabella broke the seal. The letter was short, direct. Written in a hand Isabella recognized instantly. I am dying. Consumption. The doctors give me little time. I ask nothing but this. Come to Thornfield. I would not face the end without seeing you once more. Edward Hawthorne. Isabella read the letter twice, then a third time. She did not sleep that night. By morning, her decision was made. She did not go for him. She went for herself. Thornfield Manor looked different. The grand house that once blazed with light now seemed dim and tired. Ivy crept unchecked along stone walls. Windows stood dark. The gardens lay wild and tangled. Decay had settled in, quiet and patient. Inside, the air smelled of medicine and dust. Sheets covered furniture like shrouds. The house itself felt as though it were waiting. Edward lay upstairs. When Isabella entered his chamber, she barely recognized him. The powerful Earl had become a shadow. His face was hollow, his skin pale and stretched tight over bone. His hands trembled as they rested on the coverlet. Only his eyes remained the same. Dark, intense. You came, he whispered.
I did, Isabella replied, her voice calm. Do not mistake that for forgiveness. He nodded faintly.
I would not dare. They spoke little that first day. There was too much between them. Too many years, too many words left unsaid. In the days that followed, a strange rhythm formed. Isabella sat beside his bed each afternoon. Not close, never close. A careful distance remained, firm and deliberate. Edward asked about Wickham, about her school, about the girls she taught. Isabella answered simply. She did not boast. She did not soften the truth. I found purpose, she said once. Yes, Edward replied quietly. You did. His strength faded quickly. Some days he spoke clearly. Other days, pain and fever stole his voice. On the fourth day, he asked to be taken outside. To the gardens. Isabella hesitated, then agreed. They moved slowly along broken paths. Roses grew wild, thorns unchecked. Weeds choked the beds his mother had once designed. Edward looked around with hollow eyes. I let everything go, he said, just like myself. They stopped near a stone bench. Isabella sat beside him, leaving space between them. The wind carried the scent of grass and decay. I owe you the truth, Edward said at last, not as apology, as explanation. Isabella remained silent. There was a woman before you, he continued. Juliana. I loved her, or believed I did. She betrayed me, carried another man's child, asked me to claim it. His voice faltered but did not break. I chose pride, honor. I refused her. She died. So did the child. Isabella felt the weight of his words settle heavy in her chest. So when you came to me, he said, turning to her, offering love freely, without deception, I was afraid, truly afraid. You humiliated me, Isabella said quietly. Yes, he agreed, because destroying what terrified me felt safer than risking it. Isabella stood. You took something from me, she said, her voice steady but sharp. You made me doubt my worth, my judgment, my heart. Edward bowed his head. I know. I did not come here to absolve you, she said. I will not say I forgive you. I did not ask for that. She studied him, this broken man who had once held her fate so casually. But I no longer hate you, she continued. I pity you. You lived trapped by fear. I lived free despite you. Edward's eyes filled, but no tears fell. That is my punishment, he whispered. Edward grew weaker after that day. Isabella remained, not out of love, not out of duty, out of choice. She would not let him die unseen. At night she held his hand when fever took him. When he mistook her for someone else, she did not correct him. When he woke frightened, she spoke calmly until sleep returned. One morning he pressed something into her hand, a small wooden horse, worn smooth by years of touch. My mother gave it to me, he said faintly, before I learned to be hard. Isabella closed her fingers around it. Give it to one of your students, he said. Someone braver than I was. She nodded. On the seventh night, Edward did not wake. His breathing slowed, stopped. Isabella remained until the end. She left Thornfield the next day. Edward had left her a final letter, and money, enough to change her school forever. She accepted the money. She burned the letter. Some words were not meant to be kept. Wickham welcomed her home with open arms. Children ran to meet her. Margaret clutched the wooden horse as if it were treasure. Isabella knelt among them, smiling through tired eyes. This was where she belonged. Edward Hawthorne died with regret. Isabella Everleigh lived with purpose. And that was the truth that mattered most. The morning after Edward Hawthorne died, Thornfield Manor felt empty in a way Isabella had not expected. Not quiet, empty. The house had been waiting for death, and now that it had come, there was nothing left to hold it together. Servants moved softly through corridors. Curtains remained drawn. Even the air seemed tired. Isabella stood at the window of the guest room, watching mist lift slowly from the fields beyond the gardens. Somewhere below, a carriage waited to take her away. She felt no urge to stay. Edward was gone. Whatever had tied her to Thornfield had loosened the moment his breathing stopped. The past had spoken its last word. Mrs. Dawson found her as she was fastening her cloak. "You're leaving so soon," the housekeeper said gently. "Yes." "You won't stay for the funeral." Isabella shook her head. "That is for those who belonged here. I do not."
"Mrs. Ben."
Dawson studied her for a moment, then nodded. He would have understood. Before Isabella could reply, the housekeeper held out a small leather pouch. "This was meant for you," she said. The solicitor insisted. Inside was confirmation of the annual funds Edward had arranged for the Wickham School. Proper, legal, permanent. Isabella closed the pouch. "Thank you," she said simply. As the carriage pulled away from Thornfield Manor, Isabella did not look back. She watched the road unfold ahead of her instead. Fields, stone walls, small villages waking to morning. Life. The farther she traveled, the lighter she felt. Wickham greeted her with noise and movement and warmth. Children ran alongside the carriage, shouting her name. Mrs. Winter stood at the boarding house door, hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You came back," she said, relief clear in her voice. "I told you I would." That evening, Isabella sat at the small table in her room, candle burning low, wooden horse resting beside her books. She thought of Edward, not with anger, not with tenderness, but with clarity. He had been a man shaped by fear. She had been a woman shaped by survival. They had crossed paths once, briefly, and the impact had lasted years, but it had not defined her. She slept peacefully for the first time in days. Change came quietly. With the funds Edward left, Isabella repaired the schoolhouse roof. She bought new slates and proper books. She hired an assistant, a young woman eager to learn and teach. The girls flourished. Margaret learned to read without fear. Alice began solving problems that left grown men staring in teachable silence. Confidence grew where doubt once lived. Isabella watched them and felt something settle deep within her chest. This was her legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Mrs. Winters poured tea and studied Isabella over the rim of her cup. "You're different," she said. "I feel different." "Lighter?" "Yes," Isabella smiled, as if something finally ended. Mrs. Winters nodded. Some endings free us more than beginnings ever could. Years later, people would still whisper about the Earl of Thornfield, about his cold nature, about his lonely death. They would not speak of Isabella Everleigh, and she preferred it that way. She became known instead as Miss Everleigh of Wickham, the teacher, the woman who educated generations, the woman who stood steady and kind and unyielding. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Isabella would walk alone beyond the village, watching the sky deepen into stars. She would think of love. Not the kind that begs, not the kind that humiliates, but the kind that builds. She never married. She was never lonely. Her life was full. And somewhere far behind her, in a grand house reclaimed by ivy and silence, lay the memory of a man who once said he would rather marry his horse. In the end, he died alone. She did not. And that was the truest ending of all.